Hi there and welcome to PhD at Living in part 2 of our beer series in which we talk about the brewing process. Up to this point, we know that in order to get beer, you have to ferment glucose into ethanol. And in order to get glucose, we have to cleave it from those amylopectin and amylose chains that are on our starch molecule. And to get the starch, we have to pull that off the grain that we use to make the beer. Well, that's great and all, but how do we do any of that? So glad you asked. The first step in our brewing process is called malting, and it's basically just mixing water and our grain. What that does is cause the grain to germinate. Essentially, it tries to turn into a plant. Before it gets all the way there, however, we blow hot air over it and dry that grain to cease the germination. This malting step does two big things. The first is that it releases the starch from our grain. Remember, the starch is what we're trying to release the fermentable sugars on and create that delicious ethanol. The second big part is two enzymes are released that help to break down that starch into fermentable sugar. The big two are called alpha and beta amylase. Now, I generally try to stay away from drawing protein structures because they're incredibly complex, but as a special treat, I'll try to draw my favorite for you. So this is a rough diagram of what amylase looks like. See? God, that's embarrassing. Moving on. Our next step in the process is called mashing, where we steep the grain in hot water for a while. The mash happens at about 140 to 160 Fahrenheit or so, and what happens here is these enzymes that were released in the malt start to activate and actually chew on that starch that was released in the malt as well. The starch turns into smaller carbohydrates, with the main one being maltose. Maltose is a disaccharide composed of two glucose molecules hitched together by a 1,4 glycosidic linkage. Overall, the mash here turns into a sugar-rich aqueous solution called the wort. Now the wort is then filtered off in a process called lautering. In the lautering, the solid particles from the mash are used to filter out everything in the wort. So no extra filter stuff needed. Pretty convenient, eh? Next we get to the boil. As the name suggests, this is where we take our wort and we heat it up to a nice hot temperature. What also happens here is we add our hops, and a lot of those flavors are generated. The boil stops the enzymatic activity we see in mashing, isomerizes hop resins, precipitates proteins, and sterilizes the wort. This step in particular will become very important when we talk about that 0 IBU IPA, so keep that in mind. The fourth big step is to cool down our hot sterilized wort, and I don't really have anything else to say. Finally, we get to the step everybody's been waiting for, fermentation. This is where a lot of the chemistry that I want to talk about lives, so I'm going to erase the rest of this junk and catch up with you in a second. Glucose. Good to see you, old friend. The glucose that we get in the final step of our brewing process before fermentation. Yes, I know I said the starch breaks down into maltose. Come on, it's one more step to glucose. Give me a break. Goes through a process called glycolysis and turns into something called pyruvate. Here you can see the pyruvate is a C3O3H3 with this kind of resonance thing going on here, but don't worry about that. We have C3H3O3 and there are two of them, which, if my math is correct, gives us C6H6O6. Coming from C6H12O6, you can see we're missing 6 hydrogens, and those go away in the form of water and some regular hydrogens and some energy, but that's biochemistry and we don't really want to talk about that. Next, our buddy pyruvate decarboxylates, meaning it loses a CO2, this one right here, to become acetaldehyde. Finally, the acetaldehyde is reduced to become, bing, 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 ethanol. And that's the process that the yeast uses to turn your favorite glucose all the way down to everybody's best friend, booze. And there you go, the hip, happening, awesome chemistry turning starch into ethanol. Next time we'll talk about flavors, but that's for then and this is for now. See you next time. What's your nationality? I'm a drunkard.